Right, now then, going to deal with short passage in Luke's Gospel, Luke the physician, in chapter 4. Okay. Verse 40 onwards. Or shall we indeed go back to verse 38, in which Jesus Christ leaves the physical temple. He continually arises and leaves that temple after preaching to the people good instruction, starting with the gospel, and of course going through to how he should fulfill the scriptures concerning himself. And the people heard him gladly, except of course the ministers. They wanted him out. They were proud. They were Pharisees. They didn't want others to take their place. Oh, no, 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 no. Verse 38. And he arose out of the synagogue and entered into Simon's house. You know, the houses of the Lord are common houses. The Pharisees wouldn't do this unless it was for some gain. Oh no, they don't go to houses for the good of the people. It's either a ritual, which is gain to them, because they're showing themselves as being concerned when they're not concerned. And of course, with so many, it's to wheedle their way into the affections of that householder to see what they can get eventually from them. Robbing widows' houses. They love the praise of men. Oh, they love it. They bask in it. It's the sun of their life. And without the praises of men, they wilt. And the same world over, isn't it? It's getting worse and worse as the world becomes more and more shallow and godless. Godlessness brings about utter evil of what man is, to show himself and become shallow, because the lazy side of man becomes predominant, and everybody's got a word, and everybody's accusing everybody else, because by accusing them they believe themselves to be perfect. And when challenged, oh no, I am so perfect that I'm not perfect. Oh no, I have the same faults as, and they go on, don't they? Okay. Now then, Jesus Christ left the synagogue. Paul himself abandoned the synagogue, turned his back upon that Old Testament setup. All right. And of course Christ entered into Simon Peter's house. Not the Pope. Doesn't say Pope Peter, or Pope Gregory, or Pope anything. Into the common man's house. Not into a temple that Simon Peter had erected and gathered in from the people more than 30 pieces of silver. He simply was in Simon Peter's house. Secondly, it's Simon Peter's house. Simon Peter had the ability, like 99% of all persons, to own their own house, to have their own dwelling, to abide in their own dwelling. We do not set aside rented dwellings. It's a dwelling. It's a roof over the head. We're not out on the streets deliberately, alright? Like most are today. It's an awful lot. And we are, of course, importing them. And they expect the general public to pay for them to be on the streets. We're not foolish Samaritans. We're good Samaritans. And within that goodness, we should be able to make a difference between the leeches and those that are not so. Those whom we help and those who are against all authority, who are against the establishment of a society. And they don't want to be a part of society, so they're out of houses. And indeed, let us finish up on this point. The vast majority have actually dwellings. They're on the streets for a living. They don't want to be productive, they just want to leech off people. Oh, that's some Christians, there's some people. Well, you take them into your own houses, you feed them, you clothe them, you give them money. Do you stop by every beggar and give them money? Do you? Then be quiet. Alright? Have some discernment. There are some people in this life are deserving and some are not deserving. You have to make the difference. If you don't make the difference, then you're not a fully fledged, mature Christian. Alright? You've got to have discernment in this life in order to walk before God perfect in this life. A just weight and a just balance. That's what it is all about. So how can you do righteousness if you're involved in unrighteousness? There's the two sides. Christ arose out of the synagogue and entered into Simon's house. And Simon's wife's mother, that's the mother-in-law of the Pope, the mother-in-law of the Pope. The mother-in-law of the Pope was taken with a great fever, and they besought him for her. All right. And of course it was his wife, Pope and a wife, mother-in-law, even children who were told in Matthew to remove themselves. Children. Peter had children in a house. So, let us say the Pope of Rome in a or in a terraced house with mother-in-law here, with his wife and children. Let us see that. If the Pope is supposed to be the head of the church and that he is Peter in all intents, alright, Peter is the Pope and the Pope is Peter, okay, get yourself a terraced house or whatever, just a modest house, okay, get yourself a wife, get yourself children, mother-in-law, all the works, okay, just be one of us. No, because he is the Antichrist. Sits in the place of Christ, in the temple of God, showing himself to be God. The son of perdition, That's who he is. And he's got his evangelists who say and preach that he isn't. Disinformationists. Alright. Simon Peter's wife's mother was taken with a great fever, and they besought him for her. So they besought Christ. They saw Christ as a miracle worker, a man sent by God, like Elijah and others, to perform miracles. A great prophet. These times were still the Old Testament times, even though we are reading of them in New Testament. Because outwardly it is still the Old Testament and its setup. But spiritually, the Old Testament, as we call it, that former testament that waxed old and became old, okay, was spiritually, when Christ entered the world, ended. Completely ended. And in order to begin to establish the New Testament phase and era of the church, because the church is the central body that God is concerned with. Not Jews in Palestine, not Jews around the world, not these physical Jews, but the body of Christ scattered around the world. Those like Job, those like Melchizedek, and those, of course, within Salem. The Adam, the Eve, the Abel. The Naomis, the Ruths of this world. All there. And thousands of others beside. And of course, whilst physical, literal Israel, the Jews, the Hebrews, were dying in their sins, there were those in the midst who form the body of Christ, who are rejected for those of the physical Jews by the millennialists. Oh, they champion the physical Jews, and claiming against Paul, who was the Jew of Jews, the Pharisee of Pharisees, they declare against him that the true Jew is one inwardly. We are Jews. And those who declare against us are anti-Semites and anti-Christ. And there are many antichrists in this world. Any person that opposes Christ by their lives and by their doctrine is an antichrist. And then we have the Antichrist, which all are drawn to because they come out of Imperial Roman Church. That is a fact of history, a fact of life, that many multitudes would seek to get rid of, because they don't like it. Here is Peter, Simon Peter, not Pope Peter as we say, eh? Simon Peter, the failure of failures, though not a greatest failure as Judas Iscariot, but Simon was one of us, a failure. behind me, Satan, for thou savest not the things that be of God. Thou shalt deny me thrice. He was such a failure that when Christ returned he had to separate Peter and to restore him to the fellowship of the disciples, because he was looked upon, wasn't he, with disdain. Feed my sheep. He didn't have to say it to the others, because the commandment had already been given to them to feed the sheep. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. They were all given to feed the sheep. And Peter had to be restored, and Christ restored him. The others disdained him, but Christ restored him. He was very, very, very weak, was Simon Bar-Jonas. But of course, after the establishment of the New Testament era, he became strong. And how he departed from this world, we do not know. We do not know. And why should we know? How are you going to depart this world? How am I going to depart this world? Who cares? As long as we depart this world in justification by an act of God. The world focuses, you see, upon men and women. How did they depart? In some cases it's right. How did that person come to their end? But in a general sense and rule, does it matter? To be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord, and that's that. As we say, we don't rule out an examination of how people died, passed on, departed, left this world, were translated from this world to the next. Whatever world they were translated to, the world of paradise or the world of hell. Were they dragged into hell, screaming, clutching onto this world? Or conveyed by the heavenly angels? By justification, by faith. He entered into Simon's house, and Simon's wife, his mother, was taken with great fever, and they besought him for her. Do you know we have great fevers, so called? Let us not be pagan ignorant. We have great fever stories created by governments. We have real fevers, as it were, plagues, viruses. But of late, we've had stories created and hyped, and people that have these devil's visions in their corners and are taken in by it. But as soon as they go out of the door, they see nothing of it. Nothing. Nobody dropping down dead, no ambulances racing up and down, carrying people to hospital. Nothing. They don't know anybody who's been taken by these great plagues that conveniently come after one another. How convenient is that? That your TV says, oh, you can have this plague. Sponsored by your government, and other governments join. And then once that has been tackled, another one comes along. Bit like privatisation, isn't it? One bus comes after another. Be not deceived. God is not mocked, but he mocks the ungodly by using governments to do this, because the people don't love the truth. They want the lie, they'll be given the lie, and are given the lie. That they might be damned, who had no love for the truth. They don't want the truth. They want a bit of excitement. Okay. They don't want to be grave. They don't want to be honest about themselves and about life, about anything. By the way, only true joy comes through being honest, forthright, down to earth, upon the cold pavement of life, as we say. To see things as they are, not as they are presented to be by governments, who are used by God to send delusions to the people who have turned their backs upon God. She was taken with a great fever, and they besought him for her. Now they still attended to the mother-in-law. They might have caught this great fever. But you see, human compassion. These are real, solid people of compassion. It's hard to find those characters today. Now Christ stood over her and rebuked the fever.